Hello, everybody. Over the last few weeks, we've done a number of shows from an increasingly hawkish national defense industry in the United States about what they call the China threat. I've always been, as regular viewers and listeners of the show know, a little skeptical of this. And I think to balance the Cold War atmosphere in America, which one can find now in both political parties, it's good to talk to someone who really knows China. My guest today is a China expert, but in a human way rather than a geopolitical one. He's the author of a trilogy of books, River Town, Oracle Bones, and Country Driving, about his experience in the 90s as a Peace Corps volunteer and a traveler in China. And he has a new book out, a kind of follow-up to that trilogy, Other Rivers, A Chinese Education. Peter Hessler is a very distinguished writer, much lauded around the world. He's also writes extensively for The New Yorker, and he's joining us from Denver, Colorado. Peter, congratulations on the new book. How did you go to China in the first place? Tell us the story of your awakening, of your traveling in China.
Yeah, I mean, it was very much by chance. I mean, I finished college in 1992, and for our generation, there weren't that many people who studied Chinese. It was considered very esoteric, and I didn't have any interest in it as an undergraduate. As a student, I went to graduate school for 2 years, finished in '94, and then that was actually in England. On the way home, I decided to go home to the east. So I traveled to across Eastern Europe and Russia, and really went to China only because it was at the end of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which was how I wanted to get to Asia. But once I arrived in Beijing, that was 1994, as a tourist, I was sort of grabbed by the energy of the place, and I ended up traveling around China for a few weeks, and was really impressed with the feeling that something was going on. This hadn't really become the narrative yet. I don't think it was quite recognized how much energy there was there at that point, but you could feel it on the ground. And so after that trip, I decided I wanted to try to go back and live in China and possibly learn Chinese. And so I applied to the Peace Corps, which had a new China program, and I was sent there as a volunteer in 1996 when I was 27 years old. So that was my first time living there.
What ties together the trilogy? We're going to get to the new book in a few minutes, but the trilogy of River Town, Oracle Bones, and Country Driving. What unites these books?
I mean, they span a decade. So I arrived in 1996, left in 2007, and those books are chronological in the sense that they begin at my beginning and continue for the 11 years that I was there. The first book is about the 2 years I spent in the Peace Corps, so I always think that one's more focused on a specific place, sort of on geography and the Chinese sense of place, because I was on the Yangtze River in a relatively small city.
That's
The
River
second,
Town, of course, right?
yeah, and the second book, Oracle Bones, is really looking more at time, because there's some historical aspects to that book. It has a historical story that it investigates, and I'm also looking at archaeologists and some of the links between the past and the present. And then the third book, Country Driving, was looking much more at sort of development and economics and people's how their living standards were being transformed as the country's infrastructure and the country's connections were also being transformed. And so that one looks at ranging from a village all the way to a factory town in eastern China, and in particular at how the automobile was changing
And it's
these places.
the subtitle is a Chinese road trip, appropriate enough, I guess, for an American.
Yeah, I mean, it started because I got my Chinese driver's license, and then I started sort of exploring the country by automobile. And that was at a time when they were just people in China, consumers were just beginning to buy cars, which later became very common. But at that time, it was a very new thing to do to go on a road trip in China.
Did you fall in love? I know that's a rather cliched term, Peter, with China.
I mean, I was certainly grabbed by it. As I mentioned, even in my first, just showing up as a tourist, there was something about it that grabbed me. But then living in the Peace Corps, I think, sort of solidified that largely through language. I mean, we lived in very small places. So the town I was living in, there was only one other foreigner who was also a Peace Corps volunteer. Very few people spoke any English. So if you really wanted to get around and to be connected, you wanted to learn Chinese. And so I was very motivated and picked up pretty good Chinese during those 2 years. And so that sort of solidified the relationship there. But I always found it very engaging, very, very fascinating. It was a fascinating time to be there in the 90s and 2000s. And I did connect with the individuals I met. I mean, beginning with the students that I taught in the 1990s. I mean, they were just an incredibly likable an admirable group of people because they had grown up in the countryside, which at that time was true for 83% of the Chinese population. I was teaching these people in 1996, 1998, so they'd grown up on farms, and when we say farm, it's like half an acre of land. These are very, subsistence farming basically, and a lot of them had grown up in poverty. Many of them had parents who were illiterate, but they had succeeded on the college entrance examinations and were now learning English to become teachers, teachers of English in middle schools and high schools. Some of them went on to do other things to become business people, but they were a really amazing group of people to be introduced to because they sort of represented this transition that was going on at that time, which was that Chinese were moving from the countryside to the cities. They were being transformed from a tradition of, very, very low access to education to, becoming more highly educated. And they were being transformed from, basically poor people to middle class people. All of those people I taught eventually entered the middle class. And so to witness that transformation was a, really fascinating experience. And to be honest, kind of a moving one, to watch people's lives move in this direction.
What about the politics of it all, or the lack of politics?
Yeah, I mean that's one of those things that that I write about in the new book is because there's these incredible transformations. I mean, like you look at that when I showed up in 1996, 1 out of every 12 college-age Chinese entered college. So you're talking about 8%. I went back to teach in 2019, just a little more than 20 years later, and by that point, that percentage had risen to more than 50%. More than half of Chinese young people could enter college. It's sort of an amazing transformation. The same thing, the country had gone from being overwhelmingly rural to being majority urban. You had now had a large middle class. But at the same time, the political system, it was the Chinese Communist Party was in control in 1996 when I showed up. It was a one-party state. And when I returned in 2019, it was still the Chinese Communist Party. And in some ways, it was more repressive. And I think that's one of the challenges of looking at China in this area is that we've seen some incredible change on one hand, but on other, in other aspects of life, and in particular the political system, there has not been a corresponding transformation. And I think that's a real challenge for us to try to understand this place and to figure out how to engage with it.
I want to get to other rivers in a second, but in the 90s for Rivertown, Oracle Bones, and country driving, when it came to politics, did you have a lot of political discussions with your friends, with your associates, with your fellow workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in the classroom, you had to be careful because if you talked about politics as a teacher in any way, and often this would be very indirect, if you just referred to something that might be sensitive, and as a young, 27-year-old with limited knowledge of China at the time, I often made these mistakes. And when you did that, all the students would get silent and they'd kind of drop their heads, and you'd look over the classroom, and that was a very intimidating experience. You'd have this sudden awkward silence. So you learn not to mention things in the classroom, but people talked about it outside of class all the time. I also realized that once my Chinese was better, people were more willing to talk about politics. They were more comfortable talking about it in their language. Even my students who had good English often preferred to talk about sensitive things in Chinese because they felt more comfortable. And I also realized that people in the town who were not educated, but who were entrepreneurs and just doing things outside of the system, their political ideas were very different from the people in the system, and that would include the other teachers I taught with and the people who were part of the college. So politics was there; it was always there. And in China, it's like it's part of the environment. It's something that's around, and people do talk about it.
Do you think it's the right way of thinking? I mean, again, we're going to come to other rivers in a second, but are those, if you were interviewing someone who had spent some time in China in the time you were there, do you think this Western obsession with political freedom, liberalism, the right to express yourself, that's the right way to begin to make sense of China?
Well, it's important to recognize how that functions and the limitations on it and the way that people suffer who do try to express themselves politically and who do try to change the system. The system can be brutal to them. And so that's not it's not a fallacy. It's not something we're making up. I mean, it is like that on the ground. At the same time, it is also important to understand the local perspective, which in many cases is that we had so little 20, 25 years ago, and we were able to improve our material lives. We were able to improve our educational opportunities. We were able to improve our possibilities for travel. And I think for a lot of sort of middle class Chinese, their feeling is this is okay for now. Maybe later we'll change some of these other things. So I think that's, I understand that perspective. It's not necessarily the way I would feel. But again, it's their country and their choice about what they prioritize. But I do think sometimes we put too much emphasis on the politics. And I think sometimes the sense that everything there is controlled and managed and monitored. You see the cameras everywhere, but when you're living there on the ground, you realize that there is a lot of life that goes on outside of all of that kind of surveillance. And there's so much surveillance, to be honest, that there's no way they could possibly be processing all this stuff that they're recording. And you see evidence. As a reporter, I see evidence. Like I could meet with people who are very sensitive politically and have conversations with them that obviously the government wouldn't want me to have, but they're not able to manage all of that.
You arrived in China in 1996, 7 years after Tiananmen Square. Do you think that the China of the late 80s or the mid 80s would have been radically different in terms of the cultural and political atmosphere, especially in the provincial towns you spent your time in?
Well, in the 80s, those towns were so undeveloped that the issue was really one of just poverty and people trying to figure out ways out of that. I think in Beijing and in Shanghai and some of the other major cities in the 80s, there were very vibrant communities, and there were periods in the 80s when there was a significant amount of freedom in terms of discussion. And that sort of climate was part of what led to 1989 and to those protests in Tiananmen Square, was that the system did feel like it could move more than it felt after that crackdown, obviously. So yeah, the 80s was a fascinating period. I always wished that I had been there at that time. And I was there sort of in the wake of Tiananmen, but in a place like where I lived, I think almost all of my students had no idea what had happened in 1989. And a few locals who asked me about it, they had kind of vague ideas. I mean, information was really different then, because that was before the internet. When I was there in 1996, at least in China, I did not have an email account. I did not have access to the internet, and none of the people I knew did either. That came in later.
It's interesting that they wouldn't have had knowledge. Your new book focuses on trying to think about China through education. The subtitle of Other Rivers is A Chinese Education. Has the educational system changed? I know you mentioned earlier that it's become much larger, much more of a vehicle for social mobilization or social mobility. But has it changed dramatically in other senses from the 80s or certainly the 90s when you were there?
I mean, I think the biggest change is the competitive environment and just that sense of competition, which, I think is really just critical to understanding what life is like for Chinese people. It is so amazingly competitive. And so, when I returned in 2019, I was teaching at Sichuan University, teaching college students. But at the same time, my daughters were in the Chinese public school. They were in the 3rd and 4th grade. I have twin daughters. And it was amazing how intense their education was, and how demanding. I mean, they would often have 3 to 4 hours of homework a night as 3rd graders. The kids are very aware of exam scores. I mean, when they were that young in 3rd grade, at the end of every semester, they're having a 90-minute final exam in every subject except for math, which was 100 minutes. I mean, can you imagine taking 3rd graders and having them focus for 100 minutes on a math exam? But they learn to do it. And I kind of, in my book, I describe it as like watching endurance athletes being trained. They're being trained to focus for long periods of time, because when they get to high school and they want to enter college, they have to take the Gaokao, which is the Chinese college entrance examination. So that, whereas when I was in the 90s, even though it was people wanted to get into college and so on, there was nothing near this level of competitiveness. So that's, I think, the first big difference is the competitive environment for Chinese students and people in Chinese education. I think the other thing that really was amazing about the change for young people is how much more aware and how much more internationally minded and connected they are. As I mentioned, in the 90s, of course, nobody had internet. My students weren't even aware of the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. By the time I taught at Sichuan University, pretty much almost all of my students were able to use VPNs, virtual private networks, to get around the Chinese firewall, the way, the sort of censorship apparatus, and to access other information. So they were quite savvy, they were quite aware, and a lot of them had already traveled overseas. I mean, in China, half of the passports are for people who are millennials or younger. So that younger generation knows a lot more. They know much more than young people ever did in the past in China.
I'll take a short break in a second, and we'll come back to other rivers. But Peter, in the way you presented this highly competitive, intense Chinese education system, I've heard similar descriptions of the education system, certainly in Korea and perhaps in Japan. Is there, and one has to be careful, of course, about cultural stereotyping, but is there an Asian quality to this?
I mean, I think it's Confucian, right? I mean, so I think that's the foundation is basically the cultures that have a strong Confucian foundation, or some influence of that sort. This often becomes part of it. I know in Korea there's a lot of that. And I think the Korean example is relevant in that and you see some of the same outcomes. For example, Korea has a problem with birth rate, and China is increasingly having that problem. And I mean, it's often pointed to, the issue is the one-child policy, which was around until 2018, and prevented people from having more kids. So obviously, that's the main driver. But to be honest, at this point, one of the reasons that Chinese don't want to have kids is because it's so much work to get them through school. That's what they're worried about. You talk to young Chinese, like my students who I taught, do you want to have children? And huge numbers of them don't. And when you ask them, they often say, I don't want to have to marshal my kid through all that homework and all those tests. So it does become a burden. And you see this in others, in other cultures in the region.
We are speaking with Peter Hessler, who has a very interesting new book out on China, Other Rivers, looking at contemporary China through education. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Peter are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a quarterly publication of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Peter Hessler to talk specifically about his new book, Other Rivers, A Chinese Education. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought, a quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Peter Hessler, author of Other Rivers, A Chinese Education. So Peter, specifically talking about the new book, did you intentionally go back to think about China through the prism of education, or is that just accidental, coincidental?
No, it was definitely deliberate. I mean, I left the Peace Corps in 1998, and before I left, I sort of carefully took all the addresses of the people I had taught, so that I could stay in touch. In those days, nobody had cell phones, and they didn't have email access at that point. And so initially, this was a letter correspondence, and I started this long correspondence with more than 100 of the people I taught, and I'm still in touch with more than 100. So I was in touch with them for over 20 years. And of course, I ended up living in China as a foreign correspondent in Beijing. So I would go back to that region and visit former students personally and sort of see how their lives are transformed. I've written various articles about this, but I always had the idea that I would like to go back someday and teach again and write about how those students' lives had changed and how it felt to be a teacher once more. And I settled on the idea of doing it after roughly 20 years, because that's basically a generation. And it worked for my wife and I personally. My wife is also a writer about China, Leslie Chang, and we had 2 daughters, and we wanted them to learn Chinese. So we felt like we would go back when they're old enough to be in a Chinese school and to learn Chinese. So yeah, it was something we thought a lot about, and we talked about it for years before we did it.
Yeah, and you wrote a piece last year about the double education of my twins' Chinese school. I bet your kids have had moments where they would have preferred to be in an American school.
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly challenging. I mean, the first, because they didn't speak Chinese. We didn't teach them Chinese at home. Both my wife and I speak Chinese. My wife is Chinese American, and she grew up actually Chinese was her first language at home as a child, even though she was born in America. And I learned Chinese as a Peace Corps volunteer and as a journalist. But actually, when our kids were really small, we were living in Egypt as correspondents there from 2011 to 2016. So we were studying Arabic, and our daughters were learning Arabic from their nannies, and we didn't want to throw Chinese into the mix at that point. So where we always thought, well, we'll just drop them in with no Chinese, and so they went to a Chinese public school in Chengdu, in a city in the interior, as a school of 2,000 kids, and there wasn't a single other American or Western kid in the school. So they didn't have a tradition of having foreign students. And my daughter, I picked up my daughters after the first day of school, and I mean, they just broke into tears and they said, we can't go back. We don't understand anything. It's not going to work. And, we reassured them and said, it's going to be okay. You're going to learn. And we had tutors and so on to work with them. But it was amazing how quickly that changed. I mean, the second day, no tears. The third day, they say, I can kind of understand some of the things that are going on. And by the end of that semester, they really could understand pretty much everything that was going on around them. And by the end of the second semester, they were at grade level in terms of writing and all that. It took an enormous amount of work, and they definitely struggled at times, but they're very happy they did it. And it's interesting now. I mean, they feel very connected to that side of their identity, and they really are motivated to maintain their Chinese. So they continue. I mean, often now in the summer, they'll have a class at 7 a.m. because their tutor in Chengdu is on.
How old are they now, your kids?
They're now 14, so they're about to enter high school. And so they still have the same tutor in Chengdu that they had. She's 14 hours ahead, so she stays up late. They get up early, and they do classes, and they've maintained it. So, that's heartening that they were inspired by it and they feel like it's important. But it took a lot of effort on everybody's part, probably especially Leslie, who monitored their progress the most closely and made sure they had the resources they needed.
I hope some of these China hawks in Washington, D.C. have the opportunity to read your new book, Peter. I somehow doubt they won't. What would you like them to learn? What are you telling a Western audience, particularly an American audience, about China that they don't often hear?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to always remember is we don't really have a model for this. It doesn't fit into any neat box that we have. The people talk about this, it's a new Cold War. I don't really know if that's the right kind of term for it because, there's about almost 300,000 Chinese students here in America studying right now. We have very intense trade ties with them. I mean, I one of the stories I wrote in the New Yorker and part of this book is about an internet entrepreneur, and he talked about how, after the pandemic checks were sent out in 2020, he noticed immediately an impact on his sales. So the links between these countries are so intimate that when President Trump sends out support checks to American citizens, a guy in Chengdu who's never been to America but produces shoes for export to America, he could see that immediately. He would say, "Oh yeah, my sales popped up." So these links are really close. So it's not the same as the Soviet Union. It's not the same as the Cold War. This is something different, and I think it's also different in the sense that this is a country that has had huge educational improvements and huge material improvements, which makes the equation different. I think it's harder to predict the future of this. Right now, it is definitely true. They have a very repressive regime. They have, Xi Jinping behaves like a dictator. And all of that is very disheartening, especially for somebody who was there in more open periods 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But I encourage people to understand this might not be permanent, and that sort of at the individual level, there are often many more encouraging signs. Like, for example, the people I taught in the 90s, I can't think of a single one who has become more ignorant, more closed-minded, more disconnected from the outside. I mean, actually, it's the exact opposite. That trend is the opposite. They're all more aware. They seem more thoughtful to me. Actually, they become less conservative. They tend to become, more open to new ideas as they get older. It's not really. I mean, I couldn't say the same thing about people I know in America. Actually,
yeah, I was gonna make
yeah,
that. It's not a very funny joke, but it's
Yeah.
certainly relevant.
Yeah, and at the same time, you can't say, well, that means it's going to change tomorrow, because the system does have a way of sort of suppressing these instincts, but it's there, and it does matter, right? And it really, you feel it when you're there on the ground. It isn't nearly as disheartening at the personal level.
Yeah, we've had so many conversations, mostly depressing, about China. Even people like Orville Schell, I'm sure you know his work, you probably know him, a liberal who's rather hawkish on Xis China. Does it really, though, Peter, does it affect, does Xi's authoritarianism, maybe even wannabe totalitarianism, does it affect ordinary people's lives? Does it actually impact on them?
It does, yeah. And I think there was a period earlier, sort of before Xi, when a lot of people said, "Oh, it just that stuff doesn't really impact me that much. I'm running my business or whatever." But I think now it's at the point where we have reached a stage where it does have a lot of impact. If you're doing business, it's often gotten harder to do business, and the climate kind of filters down to even the lowest level. People feel these kind of pressures. I know, for if you're a student or a teacher in China, you have so many political meetings and you have to study all the Xi Jinping thought, and it takes a lot of time and energy, and people don't really like it. And that there's more of that than there used to be. So I think it does have an impact on them. But are they connected to it? Does it change the way they really think? I mean, I was struck, and in this book I write about how I couldn't think of a single time in 2 years of teaching at Sichuan University that a student brought up Xi Jinping's name in class, which compared to the 90s, they would talk about Mao all the time, and they'd refer to Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin, the premier at the time, but they just didn't want to go there. They're just like, we've had enough of that. We have to hear about it all the time. This is our class for literature, or this is our class for journalism. The other things I was teaching, we don't want to talk about it. So you do feel that, and you feel that people are trying to avoid it and would rather it not be there at that level.
You taught at Sichuan University. What about the role of the party? The party is always, for many of us, is rather confusing. It's supposed to be a communist party, but of course, it's enabled a remarkable market capitalist revolution. Is the party evident in the university? So when you're teaching literature, is there someone always sitting at the back who is listening carefully to what you're saying?
No, there's never
Perhaps too
anybody
carefully?
there. Yeah, there's never anybody there. I mean, but they have security cameras. I mean, I describe in the book, I taught all of my classes pretty much with a security camera over my shoulder, and pointed at the students. But is the security camera on? Who's watching it? Does it get reviewed? I never saw any evidence of that. It wasn't like anybody ever called me in and said, at minute 45 of your class, this is what you said. Don't say that again. And we did talk about things that often, the party wouldn't be happy for us to talk about. So I think there's a lot of monitoring. I think there's also a lot of monitoring that doesn't get reviewed carefully, or it's just too much information to process. But the party's there. They have party meetings about the things at the college. And one change that I noticed was, in the 90s when I taught, many of my best students, the kids who were really kind of charismatic and engaging, the ones who really stood out, they had already been targeted and drawn into the party and convinced to apply for party membership. They were already party members. They're kind of the elite would join the party pretty quickly in that point because it was seen as good for their career and it was an honor. There wasn't the same dynamic from 2019 to 2021 when I looked at like the best, the most engaging students I had, the ones who really kind of jumped out at you, whether by virtue of academic performance or just their force of personality. They weren't being recruited in the same way, or not successfully. Sometimes they told me, yeah, somebody talked to me and said, you should apply for the party, but I'm not interested. So there is less of that. And this is my anecdotal observations, but there are studies by Chinese social scientists that show that elite Chinese are less interested in joining the party than they were in the past. And it's basically, a lot of it is because they don't see it as being as valuable for them, but it's also because, it doesn't grab them. It's not appealing. So I did notice that change.
Lots of stories, and again, I'm sure you're very, very familiar with this, of supposedly a digital style 1984 system being built by the authorities where you're rewarded if you're a party member or loyal to the regime and punished if you're not, and everywhere there's surveillance. It's a convenient tool for the China hawks in America. Is it true though? Or is this perhaps something that the Xi regime would like to have, but hasn't really been able to architect effectively?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true that they'd like to have it, and they've created a lot of the infrastructure. I mean, in the book, I have all these descriptions of the cameras because you notice the cameras and you count them. And I actually, I have a part in my book where I described the subway station next to our home. I counted the cameras. It's on 3 different levels, and there was 100 total in one subway station, not to mention the 2 that are in every subway car. It's a lot, right? And the classes I taught, when we'd have meetings in the department, there's always a camera somewhere in the room. But at the same time, I didn't see the evidence that that stuff was being reviewed, and I would have sensitive situations, and they weren't coming back to me. There's things like the social credit, which has been the subject of a lot of.
Yeah, the social credit is
It's interesting because that was a subject of a lot of stories. Actually, that never came up in conversation once in China. And when I, at one point when I was writing about it, I had to look up the term for it in Chinese because I never heard it. Like people don't talk about it. It's not present in their lives. So there are certain things that just are not functional really. And even like I describe in the book, there was a point where they had during the pandemic where you had a certain app that you downloaded that tracked where you were. And that was fascinating to me because when I started traveling, I realized it had these places on it that I'd never been to. And I talked to some guys like, well, what's going on? Some epidemiologists and he's like, yeah, those things are actually not as strong as they could be. And they're not using the most up-to-date technology. And, so it's not always, I think the Orwellian image of it isn't really the way it feels on the ground. And it does, with the exception being, I think, of something like Xinjiang. Like, I think when you look at what happened with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, that really is a full-on, the monitoring of just incredible closeness in a really dehumanizing way. In a very specific situation like that, it happens, no question. But that's one corner of the country. But for the rest of the country, for most people, they don't feel it at that level, and it becomes something that they generally ignore.
We've talked about the educational change. We've talked perhaps a little too much on politics. What about economics? What about the prosperity of the China of the 2020s versus the China of the 90s? How self-evident is that, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, it's a monumental change if you look at people from the 90s, right? I mean, and like the cohort of people I taught as college students, a large number of whom would come out of poverty, who, really could remember their neighbors eating tree bark and them themselves having meat a couple times a month. I mean, they have these stories like that, moving to the point where, I mean, I did a survey because I surveyed my former students. And one year, I remember I talked to more than 30 of them. Their median income was now like $35,000, which is a lot in China. Almost all, I think pretty much all of them had both an apartment and a car, at least one car. And those were things that were really inconceivable in the 90s, that, nobody would have predicted that you would see this sort of improvement. And it means a lot. It means a lot to them. And it does give them more patience than we might expect, because they often said to me, they say, yeah, there's a lot of things about the system I don't like, but I also remember what it was like 25 years ago. And I can't forget that. And I think that mentality is really important for us to understand. It's harder for us to grasp because we haven't been through that. And I myself didn't go through it, but having known people who were, who were poor and watching them make this progress, I understand why it's so important to them. And I understand why it might make them less politically inclined than I would be in their situation.
Well, presumably America went through this in the late 19th, early 20th century. Is the counter true too, Peter, that as China has become more prosperous, they've been afflicted with the same problems of prosperity, of alienation, of pollution, of traffic jams, of loneliness? Or is still China different from certainly the United States and other Western states in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, you've had this change of, when you talk about America went through this improvement as well, but I think what happened in America maybe over 2 or even more than 2 generations, the Chinese did it kind of in 1 generation, so that's sort of hard for us to grasp because it's more disorienting in some ways. Some things have improved along with that, like you mentioned, pollution, and actually in their case, the improved living standard has led to less pollution. So the cities were much more polluted in the 90s when I was there than they are now. So that's
and
something
presumably, particularly the rivers, which you've written about in lots of different ways.
Yeah, the thing that really matters is the air. I mean, I was sick the whole time in the 90s. I had sinus infections all the time, And at one point, my eardrum broke because the sinus infection was so bad. I was infected with tuberculosis, which was common in the river valleys, and the pollution kind of contributed to those respiratory ailments. And that's changed a lot. I didn't have those same problems living there later. And my friends who live in these towns say, yeah, no, I feel better now than I did. So that sort of thing has improved. But yeah, you do have this, you have a sense now that, you know, a little bit of a sense of what's next. You know, if you've improved your life to this point, do you just continue to try to improve and just continue to focus on material things, or is there something else that you want to think about that can make your life more meaningful? And many Chinese are at that point, especially many young Chinese, and many of my students were realizing that they're not sure that their lives are going to be that much better than their parents. And in the meantime, they had heard their parents have told stories, because the parents of my students from Sichuan University were basically the same age as the kids I taught in the 90s. And so they know those stories of how exciting it was to leave the village and to go to the city and to find success. They've grown up with those tales, but they're not sure if they're capable of doing that, or doing something equivalent. So yeah, you do sort of have this moment, I think, when people are looking for some deeper meaning.
Thinking about the future, you wrote an interesting piece for the New Yorker last year about how Chinese students experience America. You noted earlier that many Chinese students, or large numbers, go overseas. Some of the students who come to the US and they see all the problems in the US, do they imagine their own future? Is that a fearful experience for them?
I mean, I think one thing that has always struck me about China is, you know, that's different from what we've had in the past from very authoritarian countries is, first of all, that material improvement, but also that international contact. So you have large numbers of Chinese coming to the United States, also going to Europe, also going to Japan, going all over the place to study. And up till now, the vast majority of them have returned to China, which is really, that's kind of unprecedented. It's not like in the Soviet Union, you had, you know, hundreds of thousands of young Russians going and studying in the West and then willingly making the decision to go back. So that's an interesting dynamic. And, you know, when you talk to Chinese, they often say, you know, my family's there. I'm more comfortable there. Much of life is more convenient there. It's safer. Those were things that you often heard from people. Some of those conversations are changing to some degree. Like, I do feel like there are more young Chinese who don't want to return, partly because of the political system, but also because some of the economic avenues are not as open as they used to be. You know, I think the economy has suffered, and some of that is because of the repressive atmosphere of Xi Jinping's regime, which is not very open to business and has not been very, you know, encouraging of private entrepreneurs. They, you know, much more focused on controlling things.
Peter, we've done shows on the way in which Chinese organizations control and even use Chinese students overseas for propaganda reasons. Did this come up in other rivers in terms of your conversations with some of your students? Do you get the sense that this is another invention of the hawks, or is it something that Americans and other Western countries should be aware of?
Well, I think, I don't know how much they were the students that I was in contact with and was spending time with, I didn't feel like they were being used for propaganda purposes, but they are afraid of repercussions for people they know back in China. So, you know, and there are instances I know personally of cases where a student has been posting things on their social media, maybe while they're in the United States, and somebody makes a call to their parents in China, you know, in an interior city in China, and basically threatens them or says, you know, your kid's doing this, you need to think about this. So that's definitely present, no question. You know, that's something they think about. And I mean, I talked in that story you mentioned, I noticed that when I talked to students, of course, in China, they didn't like to mention Xi Jinping's name in a conversation. They're always afraid somebody's going to hear it or whatever. And so they would use other kind of euphemisms for the leader. And I noticed when I was in America talking to Chinese, they did the same thing. You know, when I talked to my students, people I've known for 3 or 4 years in many cases, they'd find ways to avoid mentioning his name. And I asked one of the students about it in an email after we'd had an interview. And she's like, yeah, you know, I've been conditioned. I don't like to say his name. I don't like to have it out there, even in America. And she said, you know, when her and her boyfriend would talk about anything sensitive, they'd kind of cover their phones and put their phones away, you know, and this is in California, you know, but they're they have this their fear of being monitored. And that doesn't mean that really the government is watching them that closely while they're in California, but this is the mindset. They were in this environment since they were small, and they're intensely shaped by this political pressure. So it's definitely there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you know the book by Leah Upi, the Albanian political theorist. She has a new book out, it was out last year. It's called Freedom. And she described growing up in Albania that her family had an entire language designed to talk, for example, about Hodja, but they had other names for him. So I assume when you live under this aggressive authoritarian, maybe even totalitarian system, it's probably universal to invent your own private language.
Yeah, you have these euphemisms, and I mean, there's a lot of them on social media, but also just in conversation. And again, this is different. When I was, 1996, Jiang Zemin was the premier. People weren't afraid of him. He wasn't somebody that my students were afraid to mention his name. They didn't talk around him. He wasn't, I never heard a nickname or something. It was very, very different. So this is, something that has not. I'm sure under Mao they had some equivalents. But this is something that was not the case 20 years ago.
Education, of course, Peter, goes both ways. Your book is called Other Rivers, A Chinese Education. But what about the education about America for you in your experiences in China, both in writing the trilogy and then in Other Rivers? What has all this time in China taught you about America?
I think... I feel like there are many aspects of the Chinese educational system that are problematic, but there's also so many aspects that are admirable. I really admired the teachers in my daughter's schools. They were incredibly dedicated. I also was really fascinated by the respect they had from parents. The parents in the school they would not criticize the teacher, would not attack the teacher, would not complain about the teacher. They were very respectful. That's a very deep tradition in China. And the idea was for the parents to support the teacher, and to try to help this project. And just, yeah, so there's that respect for education. I feel like we often don't have in the United States, and the kind of anti-intellectual strain that's common in the United States is also problematic. My daughters always feel like in an American school, if you're a good student, that's going to be kind of held against you socially, especially in junior high, but even in high school. And I remember that too. I went to a big public school in the middle of Missouri. And, if you're a good student, that's not really in your favor, socially. In China, it is, they admire the good students. And that was one thing that motivated my daughters to study hard in China, was that the other kids respected them more if they did better in school. We could use a little bit more of that, I think, in the United States.
Maybe Americans should embrace the Confucian tradition.
Yeah, the thing is, it's like there's good things about both, right? And at the same time that I like that aspect of the Chinese, there are other things like the Chinese, the school system, it didn't have enough physical activity, and the kids didn't have real PE classes or recess time, and my daughters really miss that, and they like that. Like in American school now, they can be on the track team and the cross country team and the basketball team. Those things mean a lot to them, and so my wife and I have always felt like we want to have try to choose the best of both. Which we've done to some degree. We've been able to manage this so that our children have been exposed to the things that we think are good about both systems. But they are quite extreme in both cases. I feel like there is kind of a middle path, which is what, I would rather see us both societies shooting for in terms of education.
Any talk in the book or in class about Taiwan, or is that another taboo subject?
Yeah, it's a taboo subject in class. You're not going to have like a discussion about it in class, but it'll come up in conversations with students. It's not at the top of their priorities. It's not something that's on their mind all the time. I personally have always felt like this, the patterns we've seen in China is that it's quite pragmatic. The leadership tends to be pragmatic, also tends to be pretty cautious. And, I think in the United States in recent years, there has been too much talk of a war over Taiwan as if it's inevitable and as if it's been scheduled. They often have these things. Yeah, the party says by 2020, whatever, they have named that 2026 or, there's often, and that to me is crazy. Like, it's
we've had people on the show talking about 2027.
Yeah, this is not how things work in China. Like, they don't dial in a war for this year and they're going to do that. And you do have to look at what recent history has been, which is this is a country that's had an unprecedented rise in the living standard, in the educational system, without a major conflict, right? Without going to war. It has not been part of their success. And that doesn't mean that it can't happen, but it does mean that this is what they've learned along the way. And they know there's a risk to it. They see the risks all over the world. I mean, the countries that go to war are not necessarily benefiting from it. So I think it's important to remember those things. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared and that you shouldn't, be concerned. But it does mean that we need to, I think, invest more in diplomacy and in thinking carefully about how we engage with China. And I would never behave as if war is going to be inevitable. I tend to be somebody who thinks it's unlikely, actually, in my opinion.
No, you've calmed us down, Peter Hessler, author of Other Rivers, A Chinese Education, a man who knows China inside out. Your fourth book on China. Congratulations. Have to get you back on the show again to give some coherent and empirical narrative about China, which is, I think, all too lacking sometimes from the hawks in DC. So, Peter, thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being here. Thanks.